All right, here's the second half of lesson 10, or the introduction to unit 2 here. So we're talking about uses and misuses of data. So the previous example talked about Lindsay. She collected very poor data, so she made very poor conclusions. She may have won the election, but to say she was going to have a 100% chance was ridiculous because of who she looked at. So let's use one you see in the newspaper maybe. So Toyota, they claim that 90% of their cars sold in North America in the last 15 years are still on the road today. So they say 90% of the cars they have sold are still on the road today. So answer the following. What's Toyota trying to convince you? So with this statement, with this claim, what are they trying to convince you? What they're trying to convince you is that Toyota cars are very dependable and last a long time. So they're saying, hey, look at 90% of the cars. That means that 9 out of every 10 cars last 15 years. That's because Toyotas are dependable and they last a long time. What other information do you think would be useful to know? So if you're looking at this and you're thinking to yourself, well, I wonder if, okay, what information would be useful? So how many cars are we talking would be an example. So there's a whole bunch of answers here. This is an open question, and your opinion may vary here. You may give different questions. So I'm just going to give a couple. How many cars are sold? Okay. How do they know? Or how did they collect this information? How do they keep track of the cars that get hurt, that get damaged and scrapped in accidents? Okay, 10% of Toyotas go to the scrapyard after accidents. Like, it seems kind of funny that way. So how do they know, or how do they collect this information? Who did the data collection? What was the criteria? How did they consider a car still being on the road? So who did the data collection? So there's a whole bunch of questions, and you probably have a couple yourself that would fit in there. So that's what I'm looking for, is just what questions would you like to know about it? So part C, is the claim as impressive if you know they sold more cars in the last 5 years as they did in the 10 years before that? So what this is saying, would you still be impressed if I tell you they sold more cars in the last 5 years than they did in the previous 10? So the claim was 90% over 15 years. So what I'm telling you, or this information I'm giving you, if I told you that they sold more in the last 5 years, so for example, let's say 5 years, they sold, say, 200,000 cars. I'm making this up. 10 years, let's say they only sold 100,000. So would you be more impressed, or are you just as impressed, or are you less impressed? And here, you kind of are less impressed because there's more cars on the road, but they're only 5 years old. The majority of these cars that are still out there, okay, there wasn't that many sold to start with. So I would say less impressive, as most of the cars are only 5 years old. All right? Hey, and you can twist it your own way, but this is really, again, this is an opinion question. But gee, a lot of the cars are only 5 years old. The majority of them are only 5 years old. So I'd say less impressive. And the last one, is the claim as impressive if you know the survey was conducted at the Stratford dealership? which is 3 years old. So what happens if it was only the Stratford dealership? And I would say less impressive again. And the reason for that, if they've only sold cars for 3 years, they only have cars that are 3 years old. So the dealership only has cars 3 years old. Now, they may have got their stats for, if I own a Toyota, I might take it to Stratford to get it serviced. But again, we're only talking about one dealership over a 3-year period. So now that statistic looks really very, very less impressive. And it's quite bold to say, based on Stratford, that this is what's happening in North America. So you got to be very, very careful when you look at a stat or a headline and determine whether, how impressed should we be with this. So it's kind of critical, asking critical questions about examples. One last example. So Shawnee surveyed 100 students at the school. So she went and talked to 100 students. Each person was asked, would you like to see MDHS make students buy and wear uniforms next year? So that is the question. It's very important, and I'll underline it here. This is the question she asked 100 students. Would you like the school to make you buy and wear uniforms next year? The results were 15 said yes, 60 said no, and 25 said don't really care one way or the other. So Shawnee made some conclusions, and this is what her conclusion was. Students at Mitchell High School do not like wearing the same clothes as everyone else. So my question is, how valid is Shawnee's solution? And better, just rewording that, do you agree with the conclusion based on her question? So she asked everyone, would you like to see Mitchell make students buy and wear uniforms next year? She said students at Mitchell do not like wearing the same clothes as everyone else. So how valid is Shawnee's conclusion? I would say not very valid. Okay, what's a better conclusion here? All right, and it comes down to the wording, and that's why it's very important. I would say students at MDHS do not want to buy and wear uniforms. That's the conclusion that should have been made instead of talking about everyone dressing the same. Okay, everyone wants to wear T-shirts. Okay, that's not what her survey asked. Her survey was specific to the uniforms, not to whether people like dressing the same as everyone else. Now, what happens if you were told that? What happens if I told you Shawnee actually just went to the next classrooms and she just surveyed grade 12 people, and the 60 people, so the 60 people that said no, so that's up here, the 60 people that said no were in grade 12. How would that change your opinion of her conclusion? So even if we wrote the better conclusion from the first part, how does interviewing that many grade 12s change your opinion? Well, grade 12s are either not here next year, or are only back for 1 year. Okay, if it was grade 11s, if you were in grade 11 and I told you next year you're going to have to buy a uniform just for the year, what would you say? You wouldn't be very happy because you're only buying the uniform for 1 year. So it tends to be a lot of money when you're only going to use it for 1 year. So buying the uniform for 1 year. Okay. What else may influence your opinion? If she just interviewed grade 12 students, it's not a good cross-section, so it's not a representative sample. Representative sample of all students. What happens if all of those grade 12s said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I'm not coming back next year, so, okay? So the grade 9s might have a different opinion from the grade 10s, who have a different opinion from the grade 11. So the fact that out of the 100 people, 60 of them were grade 12s, it's not a very, what we call a very representative sample. It's biased. So these are all examples of bias, all right? So Lindsay's example, the bias was she asked a certain group, one certain group. She just asked her best friends. Toyota, the bias, it depended on, it changed the situation as we went, but the bias depended on what information they collected. And Shawnee's bias was that she only interviewed certain people in the B part. She only interviewed people that were in grade 12. So it changes the opinion or your results from each of these surveys. So what your job is when you look at the homework and we talk one-on-one, we're going to be talking about sort of making the connection with bigger picture. So there's not a simple numeric answer for this. You're actually going to have to look at the question and think about what factors impacted or what things changed how people might have answered this information. So keep that in mind when you're working through the homework.